Hello and welcome to Zestology, new rules for living with energy, vitality and motivation. I'm Tony Wrighton, wandering the back streets of London. Sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? But it's not. I'm just recording the podcast intro. Now, today's guest is someone that I've been very excited to have on. She is Nina Teicholz, an investigative journalist who spent 9 years writing one book. 9 years. She read a lot of scientific papers, and the book went on to become a New York Times bestseller. She's become really quite famous for it. And I've heard her talking about this book before. I actually heard her on the Joe Rogan podcast, which is when I first found out about her. And the book, The Big Fat Surprise, delves into lots of themes that we regularly talk about on this podcast. High fat, low sugar diets, the effects of carbs on our health and well-being, grains and whether we should eat them or not, and loads of other stuff. She also used to be a vegetarian. She's not anymore after the findings of her 9 years of studies into saturated fats and whether they're good for us or not. So that's today's guest. And when I spoke to her, she started off by saying when the book came out, when The Big Fat Surprise came out, she had quite a negative reaction from a kind of certain part of the online community.
The trolling community is, in my experience, mainly the vegans who are offended by the idea of anybody eating really any kind of animal foods, but especially meat. There are experts who believe that a higher fat diet is not good for health, especially if those fats include animal fats, or saturated fats, or coconut oils and other saturated fat that's not animal-based. But those experts tend not to go out trolling. You know, it takes a special kind of person to want to go out and be a hater.
Yeah. I like this thought of the trolling community, as if it's like the high fat community and the trolling community. It's
a community. I think that they are a community of people, and I think that some of them are real, and some of them are, hired by maybe grain companies or fake meat companies to go out and to try to sort of bash anyone who is saying anything to the contrary. I think there's a kind of ugly war going on out there, and not all of it is real people.
When you embarked on this project and your book, The Big Fat Surprise, were you already a fan of a kind of relatively high fat, low sugar diet, or did you come into it with a totally open mind? What was the process?
Well, actually, I was a vegetarian for 25 plus years. Not strict, but definitely no red meat, no butter, rarely had eggs. I mean, I really believed the idea that meat was bad for you and that fat was bad for you. So I didn't just come into it with an open mind. I came into it dead set against what I eventually found out. And I started the whole project researching trans fats because I had been assigned to do a story on that. And that was actually what my book was supposed to be about. But then I started reading the science and discovered there was such a much bigger story out there about all fats, good fat, bad fat, non-fat, low fat. I mean, everything we had been told seemed to be completely 100% wrong. And that was a huge story. So then I had to change my whole book around.
And tell me a little bit more about what you found then, because as I was saying to you before we started recording, I always feel like I know that the high fat, low sugar diet really suits me. And it seems to be like a lot of experts on this podcast say that it works, but I can never quite remember exactly the science or the reasons behind it. So what did you find?
Well, my book is mainly focused on saturated fats, which is the kind of fats found in animal foods, but also coconut oil, palm oil. And that's why we have lean meat and why we drink, low-fat milk and low-fat cheese, or just avoid those foods altogether. And that, what my book really tells the story of is like, how do we come to believe those were bad for health? What was the science? What was really the politics? It was really much more about the politics. And so it gets to the bottom of that mystery of how those fats were unfairly vilified, and it turns out do not cause heart disease. Why is a higher fat diet healthier? Well, for a number of reasons. One, when you eat more fat, you reduce carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, which is, grains, bread, pasta, sugar, obviously, carbohydrate, even, those supposedly healthy whole grains, too many of those they really drive the process that makes you fat and gives you what we call metabolic diseases. So diabetes, and just because they constantly pump your insulin, which is a hormone that makes you fat and sick. So that's one reason a higher fat diet is healthier, because it's lower in carbohydrates. A higher fat diet is also healthier because saturated fat, number one, is the only food known to raise your HDL cholesterol. That's your good cholesterol. You're supposed to get that up, get it high. When you go to your doctor and ask him how to do that, he says, well, you can exercise, drink a little more red wine. Maybe that'll work a little bit, but the most efficient way to raise your HDL is to eat more saturated fat. So that's one other reason a higher fat diet is good. Third, it is the foods that contain fats, which are animal foods, cheese, meat, butter, eggs. Those are the foods that are the most, and also, fish and shellfish. Those are foods that are the most dense in the minerals and nutrients and vitamins that we need to sustain healthy life. So you don't get those nutrients eating pasta and rice. They're relatively nutrient free unless they've been artificially enriched and fortified. And then you don't absorb those artificial supplements as well anyway.
And this message is still massively controversial, because for all our lives we've grown up, and the people we trust, the people in authority such as doctors and politicians, have told us, look, you've got to be careful about cholesterol. Too many eggs, too many cheese. What are you thinking of, kind of getting that down you? And I guess you've made, well, I suppose you probably made quite a few enemies in the process of making this book. Not only the vegan community, the big health kind of companies as well.
Well, we live in a world where sickness is big business, and, doctors are taught to prescribe pills to people. And that's, the pharmaceutical industry makes, a huge amount of money off of that. So obviously they're not happy about people getting healthy on diet. There's a joke about how do doctors lose their patients? Either they die or they get well. And either way, that's a loss for the doctor. Which is not to say, I think most doctors genuinely want people to get better, but they just don't know anything. They haven't been taught anything about nutrition. But other enemies to this idea are, all the university professors who've made their careers for 3 generations of university professors who've made their careers off of telling, truly believing, and then telling people that they should avoid animal foods to be healthy. Right? Avoid saturated fat and cholesterol. Don't eat shellfish. Don't eat meat. Don't eat high fat dairy products. That all turns out to be wrong. So yeah, my book has been hugely controversial, but at the same time, it has also received support from some of the very top medical journals, the Lancet, the BMJ, British Medical Journal, American, some top journals have come out and said, you really need to read this book because we checked it and she's right. So there is kind of a battle raging out there right now about nutrition, but I think we're in the middle of a paradigm shift where things will really change, and we will start seeing different kinds of advice over the next 5 years or so.
Well, maybe what we need is a kind of Taoist doctor approach where you pay your doctor when you're well and not when you're sick because they've got something wrong. That's what we need to do.
That would be a good...
That would work.
Incentive system.
It's just so interesting, isn't it? Because I'm convinced of the argument, and I've been kind of on a fairly high saturated fat and low sugar, low grain diet for quite a long time, and I know it works for me, and I believe the research that it works long term. But I know a lot of my mates who are, well, despite appearances, they're very intelligent guys, and they would still say, is there a possibility, Nina, that you could be wrong on this, that you could be wrong about saturated fats and the vegans are right, or the big health communities are right, or established medical research from the last 40, 50 years might be right?
So here's let's just attack this with some numbers. Okay, so there have been now more than 70 randomized controlled clinical trials. That's the gold standard of science, where they actually show cause and effect by putting people through a medical trial. That's what they do for drugs, and they can do it for diet too. More than 70 of these on over 7,000 people, all kinds of populations, men, women, old, young, on the low carb, high fat diet. And all of those studies show that people successfully lose weight. The most recent one showed 60% of the population reversed their diabetes in 1 year. And the vast majority of their cardiovascular risk factors improve, right? Their HDL goes up, their triglycerides go down. Those are arguably the most important risk factors for heart disease, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes LDL cholesterol goes up a little bit too, and that's not good. But LDL in diet trials has never been shown to be reliably linked with your cardiovascular outcomes like heart attack and death. So in terms of diet, your LDL is not as significant. So how many trials are there? So that's 70 randomized controlled clinical trials, including some that are 2 years long, which is considered long enough to show any negative side effects, right?
Yeah.
How many clinical trials are there on the vegan diet showing that diet promotes health? There are 0 randomized controlled clinical trials. Actually, now there's one that came out showing that vegan diet was not long-term, but it showed the vegan diet helped people lose weight, but not better than a low-carb diet, which it was compared to. So that's very little evidence for a vegan diet, right? They rely on a very weak kind of evidence called epidemiology, which is far more often wrong than right. The epidemiology is just responsible for all those flip-flopping headlines like coffee is good for you, coffee is bad for you, coffee is good for you, coffee is bad. All of that comes from that very weak science called epidemiology, which is why we can't rely on that kind of science. You have to have a clinical trial. Okay, so what about the low-fat diet? There have been, because that's been our favorite diet, the diet favored by governments, the one we're told to eat, low-fat, high-grain is what that diet basically is.
Yep.
That has been tested in huge clinical trials because the governments wanted to know that diet worked, right? So more than 70,000 people have been tested on that diet in trials lasting, 7-8 years. And what does that show? Those trials came out showing low-fat diet, 0 positive benefit.
Really? And big health companies haven't even been able to cook the research.
Well, so what happened? I just want to tell you. So, zero benefit for cancer, heart disease, prevention of diabetes, or weight loss. 0. And similar body of evidence on saturated fats. 0 evidence that saturated fats causes heart disease. So, what has happened to all of that government-funded, taxpayer-funded, those clinical trials? Well, this is one of the things I found that was shocking, and I wrote this up in a peer-reviewed piece for the British Medical Journal. All of those trials, none of them ever reviewed by any of our expert dietary guideline committees here in the U.S. And everybody follows the U.S. guidelines and says they're the gold standard. But in fact, all those trials just ignored, never used to make our guidelines because they could not affirm what was already the government recommended diet, right? So, I mean, it's kind of an incredible cover-up story.
Yeah.
Evidence comes out to the contrary, and it's just ignored, denied. Nobody pays attention to it. Not in the database that we use to create our guidelines.
Sorry, were you going to carry on?
No, go ahead.
There's a quite a well-known vegan documentary on Netflix at the moment called What the Health, which kind of seems to quote a similarly kind of dizzying blizzard of statistics about why veganism is so good. And even if we eat eggs, we're probably going to die. I presume you've seen that documentary. I wonder what you think of that and the kind of claims that they make, because for your common, for your person listening who just wants to be a little bit healthy, it's quite hard to sort the facts out from the two different sides of the argument.
It is. And I really sympathize with people trying to figure it out. I mean, so yeah, that film, What the Health, says, eating an egg is like smoking cigarettes. So actually I did a complete review of every single piece of science quoted in that film. And it's on, I could send you the link. It's on dietdoctor.com if you search it.
Yeah.
So what they do is they cite in the almost exclusively those weak epidemiological studies that are not reliable. And when they do cite clinical trials, the clinical trials have they cite that they claim support their arguments. Those clinical trials actually show no significant benefit of the vegan diet or vegetarian diet. So they the evidence that they use is just this weak, unreliable evidence. It's the kind of evidence like for instance, this is the kind of evidence that they, this epidemiological evidence that shows, say, okay, people who use the internet a lot are more likely to get breast cancer, or people who eat more margarine are more likely to get divorced. I mean, you can find any association you go looking for.
Exactly.
And why it's just association and not causation. You really, and they're not objective, these studies. There has been, what happens in these, the scientists who run these studies is they just kind of go on a tear against certain foods. It's French fries cause every kind of disease according to these studies. You can find 5 or 6 studies showing French fries cause cancer and they cause heart disease and they cause diabetes. Well, they can't even separate out, is it the potatoes? Is it the oil that they're fried in?
Yeah.
And all of that data comes from food frequency questionnaires where they ask people, what did you eat for the last 6 months? How many peaches did you eat? How many pears did you eat? I mean, who can even remember what they ate yesterday? So the data is completely unreliable.
And
anyway,
very quickly, why is the data on saturated fat that you've been talking about over the last 15 minutes or so, why is that more reliable again? Just remind me. Because it's clinical studies.
Clinical, randomized controlled clinical trials that were done on saturated fats to find out if they cause heart disease, and they tested over 50,000 people on that, and they could not find any evidence that saturated fats has any effect on your cardiovascular or your total mortality.
Got it.
So that has been tested, hypothesis tested, found, null, lacking, no evidence for it.
Mm. Did it make you angry when you were putting this investigation together?
Yes. Well, it is. I mean, I think that one of the hardest things about writing my book was to try to get rid of the anger and to keep a sense of openness about it, because you do come to this conclusion that, your government has been making you fat and sick, and that at some point along the way they knew it, and that they were just not responding to any of the evidence to the contrary. And I still feel angry. I get letters every day from people who say, I was giving up on my life. I thought I tried everything. I was scrupulously on my low-fat, high-grain diet, getting sicker and sicker, and I lost my mother to diabetes and my father to heart disease. And, it's really sad. It's sad. People don't have to suffer so much.
What action do you hope people will take from reading your book? Because I suppose it's quite hard. You're not a dietitian or a doctor as such, but you've obviously come to this, this incredible, well, you had your beliefs and then they were overturned by your investigation, and you've been fairly startled by the results.
Yeah, my book cites, it really is, it cites thousands of scientific studies, which is what I read. And I think that people should read it and decide for themselves. And one of the things my book does is it considers all the arguments against my argument, right? I didn't want to necessarily be right. I mean, I didn't have a point to prove. So I really thought about, well, what are all the arguments to the contrary? That's what a good scientist or somebody who's studying science ought to do. Can I prove myself wrong? That's what you're supposed to do. And I tried. I really tried to prove myself wrong. And I put all those arguments in the book so you can see for yourself, well, what are the arguments that I normally hear? And here's the evidence for and against them. Make your own judgment, your own choice. And as I said, now that these top medical journals have come out and said, look, we've checked this book and we really believe that she's right and you need to read this. And it describes, I think what makes it convincing for people is it really tells the whole story, right? It's not just a bunch of, list of scientific studies. It tells the politics and the personality and the story of how we went wrong. And that is a kind of fun read. Actually, my favorite description of the book is by The Economist, who says it's a nutrition thriller, a page turner. Who would have thought a book on nutrition could be that? Seems like an oxymoron. But yeah, it's a good read. It's the story of our lives, really, our generation. So, and I think people can make up their own minds. And the other thing that I think is so wonderful about nutrition is that, everybody can be their own experiment of n=1, right? Like we can't do this about, let's say, something that's disputed in air pollution or environmental policy. None of us can experiment on our own to come to our own decisions or conclusions. But on your body, you can do your own experiment. Just try it. See what works on your own body.
You can, but the problem with that is that we place so much trust in our doctors. And I'm thinking about a mate of mine, for example. He's 40, maybe 41. He went to his doctor, and his doctor said, "Oh, you've got high cholesterol. You need to, really cut down on the fat and on the eggs." And I was saying, that doesn't sound right to me, mate. I think you may need to be doing something quite different if you want to get this all sorted. And he was like, "But this is what my doctor has told me." So we put so much trust in these authority figures.
Right, and doctors are the most trusted when, in fact, I know in the U.S., they get, out of all their medical training, they get 1 day of training on nutrition, and that training comes straight from those dietary guidelines that ignored all of those controlled clinical trials that I was describing. So it's unfortunate, and it's not a doctor's fault. They're taught to prescribe pills. They don't really understand the healing power that food can bring. So, but your friend, he can try going on his doctor's diet. Some of the low carb doctors that I know, they one of them said, I was going to give up being a doctor because all I was doing was seeing my patients get gradually fatter and sicker. And I was just the companion prescribing them pills along the way as they got ever fatter and sicker. And he said, it wasn't until I discovered being low carb that I could actually help cure people. What a revelation for a doctor. Yeah. So, your friend can try his doctor's advice, and then he can, if that doesn't work for him, he could try something else. I think it's true. You really, it's very hard. I mean, my husband was just told to go on a statin by his doctor, and Well,
what did he say?
What they're taught to do. Well, he just said, my wife won't let me.
Yeah, that's the scary thing, because these statins, there's all kinds of side effects, half of which we don't even know what's going on, but they're pretty powerful in a lot of different ways.
Well, the thing about statin data that scares me is that it's not public. So we really don't know what goes on with statins. It's been held by the companies themselves, and there's been no public scrutiny of that data. So what do we really know about the effects of statins? And I certainly have heard some worrisome data on the side effects of them. So, I think that personally, people used to live long lives without needing to be on lifelong drugs. I personally would not want to be on a drug my whole life. So, yeah. And my cardiovascular risk panel looks just perfect on and much better than what did when I was a vegetarian. So, and I know that's true for a lot of people too. So, I think that, and the other thing to understand is that your cardiovascular risk, heart disease is kind of part and parcel of this whole metabolic dysfunction that happens when you start to gain weight, and you start to, your blood pressure goes up, and your heart disease risk factors start to look bad. So if you go on a diet that helps you lose weight and your blood pressure goes down, you are improving your cardiovascular. It doesn't make any sense that you could get healthier in every way, but then also have higher risk of a heart attack. That just doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And certainly from a personal perspective, I've found that the high fat, low carb approach works really well, just from the way I feel, with no numbers, just the way I feel. But where do you see the future going? I mean, obviously you've spent a long time delving into the studies and making your investigation. There's no doubt that veganism is growing, despite everything that you've just told us, and it's becoming more and more popular, not just because people perceive it as being more healthy, but also better for the environment. If you were to kind of look into your crystal ball and look kind of 20 years into the future, what do you think might happen?
Well, the part of me that knows the science would like to say that, rational people would look at that science, and that science would then become policy. That policy would be a lower backing out of the low fat, high carbohydrate diet, and taking any restrictions off of saturated fats. Yeah. and that would be the official policy for everyone, or for at least for people who are obese, diabetic, have heart disease, a lower carbohydrate diet. But, we live in this alt-fact world now where, fake documentary films and, and posts on Facebook. And, we live in a world where our truths are hard to discern. And even, our expert community has turned very anti-meat for all sorts of reasons that really are not based in science. So that part of me that knows that the non-facts can become enshrined as policy or elected president. That makes me less optimistic about the truth really rising to the top. But I think I continue to think that the science will be heard because, just think about that one study I told you about, a year-long study of a low-carb diet where 60% of the patients had their diabetes reversed. That is to say, they were no longer considered diabetic. That is such a huge number. Conventional diabetes care has a reversal rate of 0.1%. So
wow.
when that starts to be known, I think it's a little bit like the genie out of the bottle. It will be almost impossible to put that back in. So, I think, so I do really have faith that the truth will be known and that we will be able to get people healthy again.
Yeah, and for people listening to this thinking, brilliant, I can make a change. I don't think high fat, high carb is quite the desired effect. It's no good having loads of cream or loads of butter and then having loads of carbs as well. That's not, then your body's getting a load of mixed messages and it's storing the weight and it's not processing the fat properly. That's not quite as good as it, I don't think.
Yeah, you just have to remember that carbs are what drive metabolic dysfunction. So carbs are what even your quinoa and your whole grains, and if you are somebody who's already tipped over to be obese, and if you're a healthy person, if you're a healthy lean person, your body can tolerate a wide range of diets. But if you're somebody who is overweight, obese, tipping into diabetes, heart disease, that means that your body is no longer so metabolically healthy, and you must, and it's almost by definition, you are unable to process carbohydrates as well as a healthy person. And you have to watch your carbohydrate intake at that point. So that doesn't mean ramping up on tons of protein. It means you just increase your fats. Fats are also satiating, so you just don't overeat on them as easily. Fat and protein are satiating. So that's the other great thing about this diet. When you asked in the beginning, higher fat and moderate protein, you don't have to count calories on that diet because you are naturally satiated by what you're eating. So calorie counting out the window, which is incredible. It's very liberating for people not to count calories.
Something I've asked everyone on this podcast is two questions. What is one book that you'd recommend, and what is one tip for living with more energy? And I'm interested to ask you this question because you're obviously quite good at making sense of very dense medical papers and studies. Sometimes I look these things up and I can't make head nor tail of it. So what is one book that you'd recommend? Is it something very dense or is it something a little more readable?
Oh, well, if you want a book on how to understand science, gosh, I don't have a good book for that. I have to say that I wish there were a book that really could just cut through everything and tell you how to like really understand science. I tend to, for fun, I read, nonfiction because it's so nice to give your brain a break from statistics and that kind of thing. So I would do something boring, like recommend a book by Jane Austen or something.
Oh, wonderful. I think that's because to be honest, I find when I read really good fiction, that's when I really relax. So I think that's a very valid recommendation.
Yeah, and to see, the beautiful use of language, and it's just exciting too, and it just engages your mind in a whole other way. And what was your other, how to have more energy?
Yeah, how to have more energy. What is one recommendation that you'd make?
I know this just sounds like I'm just repeating myself, but going low carb is an incredible energy boost. You don't, because you're not having those up and down, every time you eat sugar or carbs and your glucose goes up in your bloodstream and then you crash. Then you have to have another hit and then it goes up and then it crashes. That's why people just are exhausted at 3 or 4 in the afternoon or mid-morning, and they feel like they want to crawl back into bed. When you go low carb, you stop having those peaks and valleys, and people just find they have so much more energy. Certainly, I feel, I have to say I'm a terrible insomniac, so I don't sleep very well. But even so, I'm able to get along and not be tired at all during the day. So yeah, going low carb, great way to increase your productivity, have more energy, and feel better.
I've had a reminder of that recently because I'm kind of intermittent keto, I guess you might say, but just recently I've been eating more carbs. It's kind of gone from low carb to medium carb a little bit. And I've been feeling so tired. And I was trying to work out last week, why have I been feeling more tired? And I think it probably is that. So good reminder to get back on the keto bandwagon, really. Yeah.
Yeah. When I go off, I really feel it. I really feel badly. And it's interesting. You remember like, oh, I used to feel this way all the time.
Yeah.
I was just normal. I'd wake up in the morning and I couldn't get out of bed and I would feel horrible all day, day long. And then I'd have to go back and take a nap. And to be reminded of that is to be reminded of, how you get used to being unhealthy. You really do. You just tolerate it. It's amazing to feel so better. And, and also to feel better. Like now I'm a middle-aged woman. I feel like I wish I had known this as a young person because so much you could do with your life when you knew how to feel well.
Well, yeah, but it's kind of satisfying to feel better now than you used to.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. I went back and looked at my health records from when I was in my 20s and I was like 20 pounds heavier. Everything looked bad, and my blood, everything looked terrible. And there was a little piece of handwritten advice on that medical form saying, reduce saturated fats.
Oh no! And you probably followed it as well.
I did, yeah.
Oh no! So what are you working on now? Because the book came out a couple of years ago, didn't it?
Yeah, 2014. Right. So now I am I'm the executive director of a group called the Nutrition Coalition, which is based in Washington, D.C. And our goal is really to change the debate on nutrition and to try to change the U.S. dietary guidelines, because really all nations follow our guidelines, and they are the most important, influential policy in terms of determining what Americans and therefore the whole world eats. And we all believe they're the gold standard, and they're really not. There's all that evidence they never looked at or ever considered, but they're so hugely important, and there have not been other voices out, in the debate talking about, policymakers, people in this field really have never heard this other side of the argument. They don't know about the science. So this group is trying to educate people and trying to change that. I feel like it's just the most important thing that I could do with this knowledge right now.
Well, absolutely. Because I know even when you brought out your book, there were quite a few older school scientists who wanted you to retract it or to disprove the findings.
Well, so now you're talking about the cover story that I did for the BMJ, which said that
that was different from the book, was it?
Yeah, it was different. It was a cover story in the British Medical Journal, and it basically laid out the case for how the guidelines were not based on sound science, and that provoked. It was really the biggest ever retraction effort in recent history. 180 experts signed a letter asking to retract that paper. It went through an outside review process, which is what they do when that happens, and the BMJ stood very strongly up for the article and did not retract it. So
wow.
So all those things that I just said that seem impossible, like all those clinical trials not being reviewed, that's fact. That has been peer reviewed 3 times now. So, yes, but it was signed, that letter was signed by every single member of the Dietary Guideline Expert Committee, and experts all over the world. I mean, this is their dogma, and they do not want to see it be challenged. So, but, science will march on.
Yeah.
I really think, and that article stands now as a very powerful article that to be used and cited when you're talking to people about, look, this is not the gold standard. And in fact, the National Academy of Medicine, which is the highest scientific body in our land, came out with a report last fall saying the same thing. The guidelines lack scientific rigor. They need to be reformed. They do not use, state-of-the-art systematic reviews for the science. So, there's a growing body of evidence now confirming this. And so our group, which is at nutritioncoalition.us and receives no industry funding, no industry backing, but is, just a group of scientists, doctors, researchers, common citizens who want to see good advice. And again, because it's not just, it controls school lunches, it controls, in hospitals, it influences the guidelines all over the world. It's just so important that we get it right.
Nina, thank you so much for your work. I feel inspired by having chatted to you. No, I do. So that was the site for the organisation. But what about the book, and where can people find out everything else about what you're doing?
Well, I'm at NinaTeicholz.com. So it's NinaTeicholz.com. And that's where, more information on me and my book and my other writings I've done. And then this group is nutritioncoalition.us. And that's, of interest to people in the UK because there's a similar group that is working in the UK to try. And it's very similar issues about, low-fat, high-carb diet continues to be recommended to everybody. And so, we have a common cause in trying to change this.
There you go, Nina Teicholz. I definitely feel reinvigorated with the high-fat, low-carb diet. Not that I haven't not been invigorated by it. I know it suits me and I know I enjoy it and I know I feel good. But just having spoken to Nina and heard the scientific rigour with which she presents her arguments, it kind of confirms what I feel like I already know and the way that I'm living. So I hope you feel the same way, or I hope you feel enlightened by what you've heard from Nina. Now, I want to say hello to Richard, who's emailed me and said, Tony, when did you go orange? My podcast app just updated to the new orange layout and I feel anguish about it. Is there a reason behind the colour change? Why orange? Why the weighting of the segments to orange on the left? He says, I don't know if it's me resisting change, which I rarely do. I would embrace change, but I'm not sure I feel the new branding breathes energy, vitality and motivation. He says, otherwise, loving the podcast as per usual, and it's one of the highlights of my week. So, Richard, thanks for your honesty. I'm loving the podcast logo. And I replied to him saying, I'm often resistant to change as well. But it's not just any old orange, it's international orange, the new colour. The new Zestology logo is officially, that is actually the name of the colour, it's international orange. So there you go. And the idea is that it's kind of, zesty-like segments in zesty colours. So you can't please everyone, but I've got just a funny feeling that Richard might be a little bit happier about it in a few weeks' time once he gets used to it. There you go. Thank you for listening to Zestology, and I'll see you next time.